Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome so many alumni, so many students, so many interested members of the public, so many friends of medieval history to this, the first James Lydon lecture in medieval history and culture. My role, you will be glad to hear, is mercifully short at the moment, and having welcomed you all, I intend to pass on immediately to my colleague and the co-organizer of this event, Professor Sean Duffy, who is going to say a few words about James Lydon, after whom this lecture series is named, and who is going to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you, David. You're all very welcome. I just want, as David Ditchburn said, to say a few words about the James Lydon lectures in medieval history and culture, and why we decided to establish them. I mean, I'm looking around the audience and I see many people here who knew James Lydon, and indeed we're delighted that his nephew Don and his wife Carol have joined us here this evening. Jim Lydon passed away in June last year, but for many of us, for many years, he was one of the towering figures in our lives. He was a native of County Galway, as most of you, many of you will know, but taught here in Trinity for nearly 35 years. He arrived here as a junior lecturer in 1959 and retired as the Lecky Professor of Medieval History in 1993. Now, those present who were taught by Jim Lydon, or whoever heard him speak in public, know what a mesmerizing presence he was in a lecture theatre. And I remember Robin Frame saying at the launch of Jim's Feshrift, which was in 1995 here in college, that back in 1962-3, when Robin came to Trinity, he took Jim's course on Irish history 400 to 1485. And Robin says that English public school boys who hardly knew where Ireland was before they arrived in Trinity, or as Robin put it, stout Ulster Presbyterians for whom the study of Irish history was a slightly dubious occupation. They were so spellbound by Jim's lectures, which ranged from the Firbulg to the great Earl of Kildare, that they almost failed to notice the Cuban Missile Crisis that was happening outside the walls here. But obviously there was a great deal more to Jim Lydon than his lecturing style. I don't suppose it's possible to sum a person up in a word, but if I had to come up with a word, the word that springs to mind is passion. Because he was passionate about everything. I mean, he was passionately for things, and as his friends here will know, he could be passionately against things as well. And he was passionate about Trinity, I should say. He absolutely, passionately loved this place. And so it is appropriate that Trinity will host these lectures in his honour. But it was Trinity's very good fortune that Jim Lydon was passionate about medieval history and about medieval Irish history in particular. And it's impossible for us who knew him to think back on our dealings with him without remembering his encouragement. He was constantly encouraging people. Now, if you got it wrong, you got it in the neck, big time, as they say nowadays. But, I suppose that made the encouragement all the more effective, because you knew that if it was rubbish, he would tell you it was rubbish. So when I look back on the legacy of Jim Lydon, this is what I see. The effect this man had on those around him, and how he encouraged ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And even though he had no children himself, in a sense, his students were his children. And he lives on in their work and in the work of their students in turn. So if it's a measure of the success of a professor of medieval history to leave a subject richer for your presence, then there's no doubting Jim's success. But if there's one other thing I know about him, I know for certain that he would passionately hate me speaking about him in these terms. He would call this plomos, and it would make him cringe, I know. So I'm going to stop talking about Jim now, just to say that we, David Ditchburn, whom you heard first, and Peter Crooks, who did all the work, I have to say, as ever, in organising these events, and myself, when we decided to establish this series of lectures in Jim's honour, we modelled it on other similar lecture series, like the Stanford Lectures in Classical Civilization here in Trinity, founded in memory of Gaedhill Stanford, the Regis Professor of Greek here in college for many years, or the James Ford Lectures in British History at Oxford, or the Wiles Lectures in Cambridge, in Queen's Belfast. And like the Ford Lectures and the Wiles Lectures, the plan is that the lectures will be published in due course by an academic publisher of note. And we hope to hold them biennially. And I'm happy to inform you that our speaker for the second series of Leiden lectures in 2016 will be Robert Bartlett of the University of St Andrews, or should I say the BBC. He seems to spend most of his time on it these days. Actually, he had previously given the Fords and the Wileses, so this will be his hat-trick. But our inaugural Leiden lecturer is John Gillingham. Now, I've known John for many years, and I have a feeling that one of the many qualities he has in common with Jim Leiden is that he too is probably allergic to public praise. So I'm going to...
I wouldn't be so sure about that.
Okay. Right. Okay, well, I'm sorry I crossed that bit out now, so I'll have to try and find it. It says here that he's a very eminent scholar. And and just for those of you who are not that familiar with his work, John, who insists on mispronouncing his name Gillingham, is the Emeritus Professor of Medieval History in the, unusually for a medievalist, the London School of Economics. One of the things he's best known for is his work on Richard I, which culminated in his biography in the great Yale English Monarchs series on Richard the Lionheart. He's the man who has written the standard textbook on the Angevin Empire, England and its continental lands from the mid-12th century through to the early 13th century, the second edition of which appeared in 2001. But he's written much more widely than that and ranges from the Anglo-Saxon period up to the Wars of the Roses. And every now and then he decides to throw himself into the history of medieval Ireland and indeed the historiography of medieval Ireland. So he will look at things like the way that Irish historians have imagined the medieval past and set us thinking about important aspects of it. So he is the man, for instance, who asked why it is we refer to the people who came to Ireland in 1169 as the Normans, or the Anglo-Normans, or the Cambro-Normans, or any other kind of Normans, and asked us, why don't you just call them what they called themselves, the English? And indeed, one of John's most important collections of essays is called The English in the 12th Century, Imperialism, National Identity, and Political Values. And I hope there are some of my students here. You're meant to be reading this book at the moment, so I'm hoping that you are enjoying the experience. I haven't got to enjoy the experience yet of John's latest book because it's due out at the end of the month. It's called Conquests, Catastrophe and Recovery, Britain and Ireland 1066 to 1485. And I think that will be, obviously, like all of his work, a splendid read. And with it out of the way, he has no excuse but to write up his Leiden lectures that we're going to hear this week. The theme of John Gillingham's lectures is war, enslavement and chivalry in Irish and European history. And the plan is that John will give this formal public lecture here this evening, but we've also invited to join us a panel of distinguished medievalists to engage with him in the course of smaller seminar-type talks that John will give tomorrow and Thursday at 5:30 12:30 in the evening. So I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome Professor David Dunville of the University of Aberdeen, Professor Matthew Strickland of the University of Glasgow, and Dr. Alex Wolfe of St Andrews University. The IQ of Scotland must have taken a dive this morning when these guys got on their plane. We also hoped, by the way, that Dame Ginty Nelson would be with us of Queen's College London, but she is unwell at present. Broke her arm, in fact, which is quite unwell by any definition. And I don't want to delay things any further, just to say it is an honour, it's a privilege for me to introduce our inaugural Leiden lecturer, Professor John Gillingham, and the title of his lecture, as you can see this evening, is Enslavement and War in Irish and European History. I'll hand you over to John Gillingham.
Well, thank you very much, David and Sean. I was surprised as well as extremely honoured to be invited to give this first lecture in honour of Jim Leiden, and having heard what Sean said, I'm even more surprised, but even more honoured, and certainly delighted to be here in Dublin again. I hope that, given Jim's long-standing interest in the history of war and soldiers, I'm thinking of those articles in Irish Sword, published back in the 50s and 60s, and his interest in the nature and development of frontiers between peoples, that my subject this evening will be thought to be reasonably appropriate. For war, enslavement, and frontiers all belong together in a tight package. Slaves, on the other hand, I think appeared hardly at all in his work, though I'm sure there are many here who know his work far better than I do. But then I think he did principally deal with later medieval history of Ireland, when slavery was no longer a feature. The exception to this that I know of course, being his general book on the making of Ireland, but I don't think he ever mentioned slaves there either, except once, perhaps, under the ambiguous term, the unfree. And I should say at once, really, that what I mean by a slave is an individual who can be separated from their family and bought and sold on the market as a separate commercial item. In that sense, quite different from a serf, who may, we think, be bought and sold every now and then, but together with the plot of land or whatever on which they and probably their family worked. But the slave is, it seems to me, a quite distinct person from those others who can often be lumped together as the unfree. Yet there's an odd way in which the fact that slaves hardly appeared in his work is quite appropriate, since what I want to talk about, essentially, is the disappearance of slavery from Ireland, or to be more precise, about the discontinuance of raiding for slaves in Ireland, when that happened and in what circumstances I think it happened, and what the consequences of that were. I also want to claim that this is a development of very great importance. In 2011, Steven Pinker claimed in a book that obtained a huge amount of publicity, indeed, on its back, Steven Pinker appeared on Desert Island Discs, which in England is kind of the ultimate accolade for an academic. Pinker claimed that his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Decline of Violence in History, was, and I quote what Pinker said, "This is about what may be the most important thing that has ever happened in human history." And I want to make a case for something quite similar to that. But I do want to distinguish more sharply than Pinker did between war and other forms of violence. An obvious distinction, of course, in theory, but one in practice often elided. Historians of slavery, for example, quite often write about kidnapping and about raiding for slaves in war as though they amount to the same thing. Now, I think it's now generally accepted that endemic warfare was a characteristic feature of early Irish society, both before the Vikings arrived and long after the Vikings had settled down. And that warfare, as Thomas Bartlett has recently put it in his General History of Ireland, revolved around cattle raiding and slave taking, and had done so since time immemorial. But while the history of slavery as such has been much studied by economic historians, by historically minded anthropologists and sociologists, the history of enslavement in war has not been. Matthew Strickland has written 2 or 3 important articles on the subject, but I can only think of one monograph on the subject. Why am I doing this? Exciting. That one. By David Wyatt. His pioneering book entitled Slaves and Warriors in Medieval Britain and Ireland. One important reason for this gap in the historiography is that when people stopped enslaving slaves, no one seems to have noticed that this had happened. Although slaving in wars between Christians continued after the fall of the Roman Empire and continued for centuries, it did eventually die out, probably in the case of France, for example, by the 9th century. But so far as I can see, no Frenchman commented on this. Oh, God, why am I doing this the wrong way all the time? Until this man, Honorat Bovet, who was writing in the 1380s, the late 14th century. So, should we say, at least 400 years after the practice of enslavement, and he is the first person to comment on this change. As far as I know, no Irish writer writing in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries ever said, in the old days they used to, now we don't do this any longer. This has stopped. In that sense, so far as written sources are concerned, the ending of enslavement in war was an invisible process. In this sense, it's actually quite like the demise of slavery itself in Western Europe, which happened, and yet no contemporary seems to have noticed it happening. But whereas the end of slavery in Europe, the transition from slavery to serfdom, as it is often called, is a subject which has engaged scholars for about 200 years. Why did this happen, this transition? The end of slave raiding as a series of acts of war has passed, I think, virtually unnoticed, including in the last couple of hundred years. If we turn to the case of Ireland, we find that up until the mid-12th century, the annals, the Irish annals, are full of entries referring to raids and to the carrying off of cattle and captives. It seems to me that those people writing the annals disapprove of some acts of war. For example, they don't like attacks on churches. But they strike me as being completely neutral when they refer to raids on which captives were carried off. Laconic and neutral is how I would characterize the entries, of which there you have a couple of examples. These brief entries generally tell us nothing at all about the captives. Were they to be kept as hostages? Or were they to be kept as pawns in prisoner exchanges? Or were they going to be ransomed? The annals do not say. And none of them were important enough to be named. Were they male? Were they female? The old Irish word for captives, as I understand it, because one of the reasons I, in a way, am not the right person to be doing this. It's like, I'm not a reader of Old Irish and rely entirely on translations. But as I understand it, the Old Irish word for captives can include female as well as male prisoners, just as indeed can the masculine plural forms in Latin, captivi, captivos, can include females. Just occasionally, very occasionally, an annal explicitly says that women were taken. In the year 1111, for example, according to the Annals of Inishfallen, a raid by Mercator O'Brien against the men of Brainy, and he plundered them and carried off their women and cattle to Munster. Does the fact that it was just occasionally mentioned imply that, in general, most captives were male? And in modern usage, the word prisoner of war, of course, I think does conjure up the image of a male body. Two of the specialists in the field of the medieval slave trade, the old specialist, one might say, Charles Verlinden, and the modern one, Michael McCormick, both reckoned that nearly all slaves were male. And in that case, one would certainly expect that most prisoners of war enslaved would be male. And when Cardiff University discovered some, as they believe, shackles, neck rings for slaves, and they decided to try and see how they worked by putting some of their students through the experience of being joined together in a kind of slave gang. As you see, they picked only male bodies to be captured in this way. Now, there are two works which tell us rather more about these raids. One is the War of the Irish against the Foreigners, that early 12th century narrative composed for Mercator O'Brien, King of Munster, and purporting to describe the wars fought more than 100 years earlier by Brian Boru. And the second being the battle career of Callahan of Cashel, also composed in the early 12th century, purporting to describe Callahan, a 10th century king of Cashel, and his successors. According to the first, and I think this is number 3 on your handout, when Brian and his brother captured Limerick in 968, they killed the defenders, plundered the place, and burned it down. And then they carried away the soft, youthful, bright, matchless girls, their blooming, silk-clad women, and their active, large, well-formed boys. Everyone fit for war was killed, and everyone fit for a slave was enslaved. Clearly, in the case of Limerick in 968, the victims were pagans, Vikings. But later, when Brian's son went on a ravaging campaign in Christian Leinster, he, we are told, again in the same work, carried off many captives and cattle. And the same word was used for captives as here in Leinster as in Limerick. Similarly, according to the battle career of Callahan, after a battle, the victors, I quote, collected the cows and cattle droves of the town and its gold and its silver and its many riches, and they brought the women and the young men of the town together, and each man of them had his choice of the women afterwards. And it's been cogently argued by Mary Therese Flanagan that we should take these two 12th century works very seriously as evidence for the practice of warfare in the 12th century, although they are describing events supposed to have happened long before, that they reflect contemporary, early 12th century practices and values. She talks, indeed, about battles on land and water, use of cavalry, the practice of siege warfare. But if we take seriously what they say about that, those, as it were, purely military aspects of war, what should we also take seriously what they say about the fate of the defeated in the early 12th century war? And if we do, then it does seem that in early 12th century Ireland, the enslavement of young women and boys was regarded as praiseworthy. It was a good thing for contemporary war leaders, such as Mercator O'Brien or Cormac McCarthy, to be doing. Yeah, well, the thought that Irish men may have gone to war in order to enslave Irish women and children may be repugnant. It used to be regarded as essentially a nasty Viking practice, as you see imagined here. Not the kind of thing that any right-thinking Irishman would do to his own country people. But, as is well known, in early medieval Ireland, slave women were ubiquitous. The unit of value was a cúmal, a female slave. Moreover, in that other cradle of civilization, ancient Greece, there was simultaneously a sense of all Greeks sharing a single culture, same gods, same language, and yet also a congeries of hundreds of radically self-differentiating polities, such as, most famously, Athens and Sparta, with wars between them being fought with great intensity. Adult male captives being killed, women and children dragged off as slaves. And this does appear to be the pattern of war characteristic of many, possibly all, early societies. The Iliad and the Old Testament providing only the most famous examples. Consider, for example, Moses and the Israelites in the land of Canaan. They warred as the Lord commanded. They slew all the males. They took all the women captives and their little ones, and all their cattle and all their flocks and all their goods, but the women and children captives, the men slain. And after all, women as well as cattle are prized objects of plunder in the tale known as the cattle raid of Cooley. Indeed, a similar pattern has been observed in tribal societies into much more recent times throughout the world. Now, one entry in one set of Irish annals, the Annals of Loch Cé, is particularly important because it refers to the one and only raid mentioned in all of the Irish annals that I've been able to notice, for which there is actually corroborative evidence in sources composed outside Ireland. And this is this annal for 1138, when we're told the men of Alba plundered the north of England and carried off countless captives and numerous spoils. Well, there is a narrative of this same Scottish raid composed very soon after the event by an English chronicler called Richard of Hexham. His account couldn't be in greater contrast to the brief Irish annals. His account in the printed 19th century edition takes up 15 pages of impassioned prose. And I've just given you one or two extracts here. As you see, they spare no one, neither sex nor condition. They slaughter mercilessly. Then they carry off their plunder and the women, widows and maidens, stripped, bound, as they drive them away. And after they've been shared out with the rest of the plunder, some were freed. But the Galwegians, who the English author particularly disliked, were not so nice, and they took them back home. They were not bothered about adultery, incest, and other wicked things, and so they abused them, then either kept them as slaves or sold them on to other barbarians in exchange for cattle. Now, clearly, what Richard of Hexham is describing, he reckons, is a raid by Christian Scots, people who've been Christians for centuries, against other Christians, fellow Christians. They just happen to be living in the north of England. And it's not so much a man hunt, as it were, but a woman and children hunt with all those who got in the way, because he also talks in passages which I couldn't possibly quote the whole 15 pages, about the killing of babies and of the elderly. All those who get in the way being slaughtered. Other English chroniclers of the same time, the middle 12th century, say very similar things, though with less detail, about Welsh raids on England in the 1130s and 1140s. Now, these contemporary writers were well-informed people. Of course, being well-informed does not in the least guarantee the accuracy of their accounts. The better informed they are, the more maybe they are twisting things to get across the message they want. All of them are clearly composing deeply hostile accounts of what they, the outsiders, the Welsh, the Scots, are doing to us, the victims. 50 or 100 years earlier, in the 11th century, the English themselves had been slave-owning, slave-trading, slave-raiding people. And they had taken this kind of thing for granted, and taking it for granted, had really not written about it. That's why tell people what everyone knows happens all the time? But in the generations after the Norman conquest of England, they abandoned slavery in England. And by the 1130s, they had come to regard such practices as barbarous, and in consequence, they wrote violently about them. Now, because they wrote so violently, and because there are no contemporary Scottish sources at all surviving, these English narratives, particularly Richard of Hexham's, were long dismissed as propagandist atrocity stories of no serious worth for what actually happened at all. Yet if we turn to contemporary Welsh material, then we can find a kind of corroboration for these English-centered accounts. This, for example, is a very brief quotation from the anonymous biography of the Welsh king Griffith ap Conan, written very soon after his death in 1137. It praises him for the ferocity of his war against a fellow Welsh ruler and strengthens the impression that in the minds of those looking for slaves, women were the primary targets. For, as you see here, we're told that Griffith, after defeating and killing his own Welsh rival, Trahan, invaded Trahan's lands and dragged the wives and daughters of Trahan's followers into captivity. And this too, as you see, is a Christian, long centuries of having been Christian against another Christian people. Of course, laconic phrases such as this Latin biography of Griffith ap Conan contain none of the horrifying details on which Richard of Hexham dwelt, the killing of elderly parents, of babies, and the very young children. But if we think about it, I'm afraid that if captives were to be seized in war and rapidly removed to places where they could be held securely, it was in practice often necessary to kill not only everyone who put up a fight, hence the slaughter of adult men, but also anyone who got in the way, those categories of persons whom you couldn't usefully put to work or couldn't sell, but whose lamenting, clinging presence would have slowed down and endangered the whole precarious, frightening operation. Propagandist narratives like Richard of Hexham's story may well be, but the mere fact that they're propagandist doesn't mean that their descriptions of slave hunts weren't reasonably accurate reflections of what the horrors of a slave hunt actually involved. And that such was the harsh reality of a form of warfare in which women and children were important items of plunder is clearly indicated by authors writing in a different part of Europe, the Baltic, which is also another region which saw lots of fluctuating frontiers and wars between temporary chieftainships and lordships there. Several German authors, writing in the 13th and 14th centuries, describe wars fought by the churches and military orders to which they themselves belonged in terms very similar to those that Richard of Hexham had used, but without the shocked tone, simply quite neutral in tone. And they're not shocked, because quite often it's not only our enemies who are doing this to us, it is we who are doing it to them. Henry of Livonia, for example, a priest belonging to the bishopric of Riga, writing in the 1220s, tells the story of the conquest and conversion of the Estonians, in which he himself was a participant, an eyewitness of a great deal of it, and of a raid against the Estonians in 1216, as you say, when we arrived there, we burned, we killed, we captured, and so on. This is what we are doing to them. And time again, in the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia, you find the same pattern of words. In the 14-year period between 1208, when the conquest of Estonia began, and 1221, Henry described no less than 26 raids by Christians against heathen Estonians, which operated this same policy of sex discrimination. In one raid, yes, in 1215, as you see, they capture various men and they torture the men. They keep them alive and torture them until they reveal those places where the women and children have gone to hide, realizing that raids were coming and what the raiders were coming for. Of a raid in 1208, launched by his own parishioners, members of his own church, he noted that, exhausted by so much killing, they returned home, bringing back with them herds of animals and a great many girls, whom alone the armies of this region customarily spare. A comment which implies that this was standard practice in early 13th century in the Baltic region. Now, we know so much about warfare in this region in the 13th centuries, as in the 14th also, because these German authors were crusaders, very keen to publicize their struggle against heathen enemies. But religion was not the only thing at stake in these wars, and at times they went to war against fellow Christians. Henry, for example, reports a raid launched in 1219 against the Orthodox Russian Rus, the early Russians. Killing the men and seizing the women, they gave them no respite until they had carried off their flocks and their women. Just exactly the same pattern here against Orthodox Christians. Of course, Orthodox, not Latin, not Western Christendoms. Or consider an episode in 1290, as reported by a couple of chroniclers belonging to the Teutonic Order, Peter of Duisburg and Nicholas von Jeroschin, the one whom I've quoted here. What had happened here in 1216 is that the pagan Lithuanians had ravaged the land of the Curonians, Kurland, and had carried off the women and children of the Curonians. The knights of the Teutonic Order prepared to chase after this and invade Lithuania in order to get the Curonian people back. And the native Curonians, who themselves were now Christian, asked the knights that if God went with them, if they were successful, could we have our women and children back? The knights' brothers were inclined to agree, according to this chronicle, but the common people of Prussia and Livonia, the common soldiers whom the knight brothers were going to lead to war, refused to do this. They said that no, what must happen with the captives is what always happens, i.e., if we get their women and children back, they are ours. We are not going to return them to the families. And that women were the main targets in early British slave hunts is suggested by the open letter sent at some unknown date, probably in the 5th century, by Patrick to a warlord named Coroticus, a fellow Christian Roman Britain. As you know, of course, Coroticus's men had killed and captured some of Patrick's Irish converts to Christianity. How many of them were male and how many female, Patrick never said. But he was clearly principally agitated about the women. The letter ends with a plea to Coroticus to release female captives, the captivas baptizatas. And it refers to Coroticus and his men sharing out poor baptized women as prizes, or selling them on to foreign peoples as though to a brothel. And in the 13th century, Henry of Livonia had accused the Estonians of much the same behavior. The Estonians had been out to capture women, they violated them or took them as wives. Each of them, the pagan Estonians, Henry said, having 2 or 3 wives or more. And if they didn't keep them like this, then they sold them on to other heathens, just as Patrick accuses Coroticus of doing. And of course, we might remember that in 13th century Eastern Europe, just as in 5th century Britain, and as indeed in much of the early medieval West, we see societies in which powerful men have lots of women, including probably several wives. Well, one reason I suspect for the near invisibility of the enslavement of women and children as a subject in Western European history is that it wasn't an especially heroic moment in warfare. It was neither heroic nor was it exceptional. It was probably quite routine, and which artist would represent the unheroic routine? And this is actually the only representation of this activity that I'm talking about that I have so far been able to discover. It's a 15th century French, it is a manuscript painting of a translation of St. Augustine's De Civitate Dei, talking about the sack of Rome. I haven't yet found any other. Now, anyone who can help me to find other representations of this, I would be extremely grateful. Also, it's invisible because economic historians have not been much interested in societies with slaves, of which perhaps most societies in early human history have been societies with slaves. Economic historians have been interested in what they call slave societies, which they define as being those societies in which a significant proportion of production was the work of slaves, not an insignificant bit of production and work. And economic historians have thought of men's work as being the significant part of the work of production, of modes of production. It being much easier, of course, to measure and quantify men's work than women's work. I mean, cleaning, washing, mending, childcare, sex on demand. I mean, as we know, these are not things which are easily taken account of in public policy, easily measured. And although we know the names of a few captives in early medieval history, virtually all of the individuals whom we can name were men. In Irish history, I think the prisoners of war with names are Patrick, Findan, Gaill of Skellig Michael, and Moriut, the central figure in an 11th century story by a man called Warren of Rouen. I'm hoping to discover during my trip here this year the names perhaps a woman whose name we know and whose story is that she was captured in war and was enslaved. I can think of some female slaves, but I'm not sure that we know that they are captured in war. 2 of these 4 male names, Findan and Moriut, only fell into the hands of the Vikings because they tried to recover women who the Vikings had already taken, and they went after them. And I think whatever happened to these captives later, and some women in particular, were successfully assimilated into the society which took them, we have to remember that they had been violently carried off, and their families had suffered the slaughter, which inevitably went hand in hand with the slave raid. I assume, indeed, that some women had the qualities which enabled them to turn enslavement into an opportunity, to make a fresh start in a new environment in which, for example, their humble family origins didn't count for anything, and that all that mattered was their own native wit, attractiveness, whatever, which they could now give full play to in this new surrounding. But I don't know of any Irish examples yet of a woman who made a success, as it were, of being enslaved. There are some famous examples. And in any case, for the overwhelming majority of those enslaved, the experience of being violently separated from family and neighbors in the action of the slave raid was disastrous, catastrophic. A fate clearly worse than rape, partly because it might well involve multiple subsequent rape, even if it was by your master and owner. There are modern biographies, such as that by a woman called Menda Naza, a Nuba girl enslaved by Arab raiders in the 1990s, which can give us a sense of the trauma involved in being the victim of a slave raid. And the same is revealed, and I don't know of any parallel, but I'm hoping to discover more to this. The description by one of the great Arab historians of the early mid-13th century, Ibn al-Athir of Mosul, who, when he was a young man, was involved and helped profit from the sack of the city of Jaffa by Saladin in 1187. And as you see, I quote, I had a slave girl, one of the people of Jaffa, one of those who had been taken when Jaffa was sacked. She was the mother of a child about a year old, and she dropped him and wept greatly, though he was not really hurt. And I calmed her down and told her, well, there's no need to cry. It was so small an episode. And as you see what she said, it's not for my little boy I'm weeping, but for what happened to us at Jaffa. My 6 brothers, all have killed. I have a husband, and I have no idea what happened to them. And when I read Brendan Kennelly's words in his poem in honor of Jim Leyden, at the beginning of the Feshrif for Jim, and those words, I as historian, let's speak again the age's buried voices, and so defy the killing power of time. I do think of the buried voice of that slave girl in Aleppo, taken from Jaffa, and her words reported by a man whose name we do know, and of course we do not know her name. I also note, of course, that the sex of the people mentioned in the first 2 lines of that. Of course, there were other paths into slavery, other than war. In hard times, parents were prepared to sell their children into slavery. In the Irish Annals, this is reported under the years 965, 1112, and 1116. But the bloodshed that accompanied capture in war must have made this particular pathway particularly horrible. And where so much was at stake in war, where women and children were among the principal targets of war, where battles, in other words, were truly, realistically, viscerally fought to protect hearth and home, women and children, is it any wonder that a mid-12th century visitor to Ireland described the land as being famous for its cruel battles? Now, that women were among the chief, if not the chief, victims of slave-taking wars has been, I suppose, emphasized for some decades now by feminist historians. But because they focused on slavery and rape and the creation of patriarchy, I think what they haven't done is ask what were the implications of the ending of enslavement in war, except sometimes to imply that enslavement was replaced by rape. But I think that rape, nasty though it clearly is less horrible than enslavement. And the most influential historians of this school, Susan Brown Miller, for example, or Gerda Lerner, have, I think, followed the pattern of their male counterparts by leaping straight from the history of antiquity to the history of modern times. They've talked about enslavement or raiding for women in antiquity, then talked about enslavement and rape in modern war. But what the hell happened between 500 and 1600 or so? You just leave that out, because that's what historians do. They go from antiquity to the modern time, the Middle Ages is good for nothing, but there's been no medieval barbarity or something. That's the usual expression these days. Well, when did slave raiding end in Ireland? According to David Wyatt, King Henry II, arriving in 1171, followed the advice of his ecclesiastical advisors, believed that his chivalric and pious image as a supporter of church reform would be more useful to him than any economic gain from continuing with slaving, and so he banned the slave trade of Ireland. And if we like to think of Henry II as a nice English king, then we could think of this as a nice thing that the English brought to Ireland. But of course, for this, there is absolutely not a single shred of evidence of any sort. And what evidence there is for opinions of King Henry II's ecclesiastical advisors suggests they were concerned about questions like the proper payment of tithes and making sure that baptisms were carried out in the approved way, not about slaves or slave raiding. And indeed, if you look at the letters which the Pope of the time, Pope Alexander III, sent to Henry II and the bishops of Ireland in the early 1170s, there's not a word about please stop slave raiding or please stop indulging in the slave trade. And I think the chronology is very important here. The Annals of Loch Cé, for example, report many instances of Turlough and Rory O'Connor carrying off captives in the first half of the 12th century, but no clear-cut case, I think, after 1151. In the Annals of Ulster, I know of no case after 1166, which may mean none after 1130, because there's a lacuna in the Annals of Ulster. In the Annals of Loch Cé, the last episode is the Scottish raid on the English in 1138. So it seems to me, reading the chronology of the Irish Annals, that slave raiding in Irish warfare was already well on the way out, possibly had already gone before the English invasion of 1169-1171. True, Gerald de Barry claimed that in 1170 a synod at Armagh ordered the liberation of all the English slaves in Ireland, but I suppose they might have been slaves taken several decades earlier, still alive and still enslaved. And the fact that in his catalogue of Irish vices, which, as I'm sure you all know, is quite a long catalogue in Gerald, he never once accused the Irish kings of enslaving women and children, seems to me to be a very revealing silence. Seems to be they were not doing it anymore. In this sphere, in other words, the English invasion of Ireland did not play the same role as the Norman invasion of England. Slave raiding in inner Irish warfare came to an end during the 12th century. Why it happened then is certainly hard to say. But it was part of a process which might be called the Europeanization, or perhaps better, the Western Europeanization of Britain and Ireland in the 11th and 12th centuries. By 1066, slavery had died out in Normandy, and following the Norman conquest of England, slavery gradually died out in England too. Well, I've really included this slide because desperate to find images which might talk about women and children being enslaved, it is just possible that this picture from the Bayer tapestry is an allusion to that, but it may simply be a picture of a woman and child escaping from a house which has been set on fire. There is a contemporary French writer who does say that women and children were enslaved, but I can't be sure of it. But as I said, pretty desperate. According to a life of St Brigit, composed by this author, Lawrence of Durham, in the 1130s, one of the few 12th century portraits of a literary chap, Lawrence of Durham wrote, as you see, after the English were under Norman rule, so after 1066, they no longer suffered from non-natives that which they suffered at their own hands. In this respect, they found that foreigners were treating them better than they had treated themselves. Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, born in Italy, for many years an abbot in Normandy, led a campaign against the trade in selling slaves to the Irish, selling English slaves to the Irish. And this in turn might have led to a decline in Irish slaves being sold abroad. With fewer or no dealers in the background, the profits to be arrived from capturing women and children might have become too small to be worth the risk of hunting them down. A dangerous activity involving the search for hiding places, as we've seen, and requiring guarding and moving very reluctant human beings, human prey, during which time the attackers, the invaders, would themselves have been very vulnerable to counter strikes. So it was a risky business, slave raiding. And if the discontinuance of slave raiding was largely based on a multiplicity of ad hoc pragmatic calculations in each case of this kind, then perhaps the absence of any comment about, there are no slave raids aren't happening anymore. No one says that. But perhaps in that case, given that there was no ecclesiastical, there was no church campaign against slave raiding. There was against slave trading people abroad, but no one says you should not go raiding for slaves. It just dies out without there being any campaign. In the context of a Europeanization of the culture and war and politics, the 1138 Scottish raid on the north, to which I've referred several times, is, I think, uniquely important. According to Richard of Hexham, Albric, Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, appointed papal legate to England and Scotland by Pope Innocent II, came north in an attempt to broker peace between English and the Scots. He met King David I and the Scottish magnates at Carlisle in 1138. And there, as you see, the Galwegians promised him they would free the women and children they had captured. And this is the nearest thing I've yet discovered, I hope to discover more, that might be called in some way a campaign against enslavement, against people explicitly saying enslavement is wrong, you should stop it. And as you see, it then goes on, as it were, to a kind of a definition of the non-competent, to define what a non-competent is compared with competent, and say that you shouldn't make war against non-competence. And I don't know of any clear parallel to that. I think that at Carlisle, the legate Albric was probably quite influential. After all, he wasn't an Englishman telling the Scots what they should do, which might not have worked so well. He was a papal legate and prepared to fall at the feet of the King of the Scots and beg him to stop, which was probably an astute diplomatic move if he wanted to have influence. But I think it seems likely that he was pushing at a door which was already half open. It looks from what Richard of Hexham says and other bits of evidence that with the encouragement particularly of King David of Scotland, The fact that King David is represented on a mid-12th century charter, issuing a charter is itself an expression of a kind of modernizing approach to the business of government. And we have lots of evidence that King David was attempting to, consciously attempting to modernize and civilize Scottish society, by which I mean move it to English, the sorts of standards that English chroniclers approved of. And quite a few people in Scotland were clearly going along with this. So it seems likely that when the legate Alberic arrived at Carlisle, he was arriving in a situation where within a single polity, opinions were already divided about the good sense, morality of slaving or not slaving, and that in that situation overt ecclesiastical pressure could perhaps be effective and decisive. Now, given that Irish churchmen also brokered peace agreements, it's certainly possible, I think, that some of them may have tried to do an Alberic and get captives returned without a ransom, without payment of money, but simply as a good thing to do. But I don't know of any evidence yet showing an Irish religious leader carrying out that. I hope to, perhaps, before I leave Dublin, to have found some. Well, I want to finish, really, here. Whereas the end of slavery in Western Europe, this transition from slavery to serfdom, is a subject which has engaged scholars for nearly 200 years, the end of slave raiding has passed almost unnoticed. Stephen Neff, in this modern book, is an exception. He noted and said that the discontinuance of the ancient practice of enslaving prisoners of war in wars between Christians as the most striking innovation. But he said nothing more about it. And really there was very little he could say more about it, given the absence of scholarly literature on the subject. And surely, had there been any scholarly literature, it would surely have been cited in Steven Pinker's book on the better angels of our nature, his book on the decline of violence in history. In Pinker's first chapter, in which he outlined a rough chronological overview of his subject, the decline of violence in history, from prehistory to the 20th century, he dealt with the capture and enslavement of women and children under two headings, Homeric Greece and the Hebrew Bible. But once past the world of the New Testament, that subject simply disappears from view in Steven Pinker's book, and is replaced by themes such as torture rates or varying homicide rates in different parts of Europe, under headings such as early Christendom and medieval knights. But surely the discontinuance of a mode of war in which adult males were killed, and the elderly and babies were killed too, so that women and children could be carried off, intentionally carried off, the discontinuance of that mode of war meant surely that a higher proportion of the population, particularly in frontier regions, but not only there, was much less vulnerable to violence than before. This surely was a transition extraordinarily well suited to Pinker's overarching line of argument, yet, curiously, there is absolutely no sign of it in Steven Pinker's book and in other similar books. The questions of just how, when, and why so entrenched a practice fell into disuse are not even broached in that book. Just as remarkable, it seems to me, is the fact that this extraordinary gap in Pinker's argument is hardly, and indeed perhaps not at all, mentioned by the many critics of Pinker's work. They've almost always focused on his account of 20th century history or his version of statistics, or both. But they never say anything about enslavement and the end of enslavement. And in part, this once again, I think, reflects that very venerable tradition of historians who've liked to move from the ancient world to what they comically label the early modern period without imagining that anything of importance might have happened in between. Well, in this lecture, I've not been so much concerned with the causes of this transition as with the impact of slave-raiding warfare on the lives of those caught up in it. By using narratives composed outside Ireland, I've tried to envisage something of a reality which contemporary Irish authors, like all early medieval authors, had no interest whatever in telling us. But Richard of Hexham and Henry of Livonia reveal the savagery of this kind of total war. The withering away of slave raiding helped a new kind of war to emerge within Europe, a much more chivalrous war, one in which women and children may well have been the collateral victims of war, but were not systematically targeted. And this change in the morality of war contributed hugely to the decline of violence in war in history, including Irish history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Just before you started, you hinted that you were not averse to a little bit of praise, and I think do you? Oh dear. But I certainly think that in my own view anyway, that that performance was certainly worthy of a large dose of praise. That was a real treat, a methodologically incisive, masterly analysis of slavery, which has taken us all the way from Ireland and the insular world to Aleppo and the Baltic.